Hello, this is Pam, and welcome to the Tuesday edition of the Christian Science Monitor. Here is our first article. States band together to take next step against coronavirus. States are forming regional partnerships to ensure the steps they take towards reopening are responsible, coordinated, and in some cases, bipartisan. By Francis Kiefer, staff writer. David Postman was looking forward to his first day off in more than 6 weeks. As chief of staff to the governor of Washington State, where the novel coronavirus burst early in the United States, he figured the Easter weekend might provide that opportunity. It was not to be. Instead, he spent the weekend teleconferencing and texting with his counterparts in Oregon and California. The 3 chiefs of staff were working on a formal collaboration between their West Coast states, and the governors wanted to move quickly. Rumblings were coming from President Donald Trump about an upcoming decision to reopen states' economies. "We need to be out there. We want to show people that we are working together," says Mr. Postman, recalling the urgency of the moment. On Monday morning, the governors, all of them Democrats, agreed to guidelines for reopening their economies, including a decline in the rate of the virus's spread, more testing, and protecting vulnerable populations. The same day, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, also a Democrat, announced a coalition of northeastern states, followed later in the week by a bipartisan Great Lakes group. On one hand, states cooperate on a daily basis, from local agreements on transport to larger ones that affect regions, such as eastern states capping greenhouse gases and western ones sharing Colorado River water. And when hurricanes, fires, or floods hit, states are quickly to send firefighters and utility trucks. But nothing is testing governors like COVID-19. It stretches across the entire country, and it is unpredicated and harder to control. While governors say they will rely on science to open up their economies, the science is not so clear. And opening up will be harder than shutting down, as governors compete for equipment and struggle to maintain health standards in the face of mounting pushback, costs, and skyrocketing unemployment. To this point, that is the key question binding these partnerships. How do they reopen responsibly and strategically? For instance, when is it okay to allow elective surgeries, or how to conduct contact tracing? The coalitions are a reminder that even as the political poison in Congress has leaked into the states, relationships among governors are nothing like it is in Washington, says former New Jersey Governor Thomas Kean. Members of Congress are graded on speeches and votes, he explains. Governors, on the other hand, get graded on what you've done, period. That means getting the next steps right, and governors know they'll need one another. The effects of this pandemic is so much more widespread than any other calamity or emergency or crisis in anyone's memory, and its path and duration are hard to predict, said John Weingart, director of the Center on the American Governor at Rutgers University in New Jersey. No one wants restrictions relaxed too soon, but what nobody knows is the definition of too soon. Remember Dick Thornburgh? Emergency planning is the very first thing new governors learn about when they gather after Election Day for training by the National Governors Association. A telling example for the newbies. Pennsylvania Governor Dick Thornburgh, in 1979, after less than 3 months in office, he had to deal with the accident at the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant. States should be able to count on federal help with resources, guidance, and expertise, Mr. Weingart said. On Thursday, Congress passed nearly $500 billion in coronavirus-related aid on top of $2.5 trillion already passed. But generally, states would prefer to rely on each other as opposed to the federal government, says Raymond Shapak, former executive director of the National Governors Association. They understand each other, and they'll get answers quicker. They even have a formal compact that allows them to share assistance during emergencies, including smoke jumpers, National Guardmen, and equipment. In today's crisis, regional cooperation is the only way to do it, says Mr. Keene, a popular two-term governor in the 1980s. What if New Jersey were to open its beaches before New York? He posts. All the people in New York are going to come to our beaches. He and Democrat Mario Cuomo, a former New York governor, met at least once a month over dinner or lunch. They became close friends. Good relationships with the governors of Massachusetts and North Carolina also led to the governors stealing ideas from one another, he says. That same approach must apply now, many governors say. Republican Governor Charlie Baker of Massachusetts spoke in a local TV interview Monday about the need to get over the baloney and the noise of partisan politics. We're all in this together, and we need to behave and act like that, he said, rattling off the names of his counterparts from Maine to New Jersey, most of whom are Democrats. Regional cooperation is vital, he said last week, given how integrated New England states' economies are. About 250,000 out-of-state drivers enter Massachusetts on an average weekday, including 150,000 commuters from New Hampshire and Rhode Island. Part of the planning also requires listening to and learning from our neighboring states, Governor Baker said, though he emphasized that he would always act first and foremost in the interest of the Massachusetts citizens. That is the balancing act ahead, weighing one's state's needs and even counties within states against the needs of neighbors. The point was stressed by the 7 Midwestern governors who formed a bipartisan coalition in the broader Great Lakes area. The group includes Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Illinois, Kentucky, Ohio, and Indiana. Phasing in sectors of our economy will be most effective when we work together as a region, they said in an April 16 statement. This doesn't mean our economy will reopen all at once or that every state will take the same steps at the same time, but close coordination will ensure that we get this right. Relationship with D.C. Some governors have butted heads with the president over his authority over shortages of tests and personal protective equipment and his encouragement of protesters to liberate certain Democratic states from restrictions, but they have generally praised the Center for Disease Control and Prevention for its expertise and Vice President Mike Pence for his outreach. And Wednesday saw California's Governor Gavin Newsom, who has led the Democratic resistance against the president, touting a very good phone call with President Trump. More testing swabs are on the way, the president assured him. In that way, the cooperation between states is not just about filling federal gaps, suggests Mr. Weingart. It seems clear that the effect of the virus is different in different parts of the country or on a different schedule, and it's a healthy response for states to band together in some instances. This week, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis announced that 6 southeastern states are forming a coalition to share ideas about reopening. They are moving more quickly and broadly to loosen restrictions than their Democratic counterparts, though Colorado's Democratic governor announced he will let his state's stay-at-home order expire next week and allow businesses to reopen with restrictions. Mr. Shepard expects that governors will become closer because of this challenge and hopes their efforts will lead to greater cooperation in the future. So far, the American public has given governors high marks for their handling of the crisis, with 76% of the Democrats and 73% of the Republicans praising their state's governors, according to a Monmouth University poll released last month. We know we need each other's expertise, support ideas, troubleshooting, says Washington State's Mr. Postman. Should states face something like this again, let's go back and remember what we did to collaborate in 2020. Staff writer Christina Case Bryant and contributes to this report from Boston. Our next article is titled Nuclear Proliferation: How Coronavirus Crisis is Opportunity. Nuclear proliferation is a global issue that's been overshadowed by the coronavirus. Delaying the NPT conference may have bought much needed time. By Howard LaFranchi, staff writer. With the world caught in the throes of the coronavirus pandemic, the global threat that much of the international community once worried about most, the proliferation of nuclear weapons and the risk of a cataclysmic nuclear winter, has largely vanished from public thought. The issue has quite literally retreated from the international stage, the pandemic having forced the postponement of the every 5-year review conference of the half-century-old Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, or the NPT. The gathering of hundreds of diplomats and nuclear issues officials from the NPT's 191 member states was to have been held at the United Nations in New York for a month beginning next week. The UN officials have delayed the conference until 2021. Yet, while predictions of a rancorous and divisive NPT review conference were flying high earlier this year, the postponement is increasingly being viewed as an opportunity. Among other reasons for the dour predictions, the world's nuclear weapons states, including the United States, Russia, and China, were in for a drubbing from non-nuclear states for undoing disarmament accords and modernizing and expanding nuclear arsenals, experts said. For some experts in nuclear issues, the year ahead now opens the door to serious discussions of ways of fortifying the NPT, particularly by hardening the consequences of member states withdrawing from the treaty, as North Korea did in 2003. With the leaders of Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and other countries musing at times about the treaty's unacceptable limits or even leaving the NPT, some say it's time to focus on barring the door to a future wave of nuclear arms proliferation. Opportunities for leadership. If you have an extra year, it should be used to consider other ideas and priorities than what typically consumes the conversation, and new ways of interpreting the treaty to preserve its integrity, says Henry Sokolsky, Executive Director of the Non-Proliferation Policy Education Center in Washington. It would be smart to focus a bit more on non-proliferation and maybe a bit less on disarmament, which tends to consume everyone but doesn't get the traction people are looking for, he says. Some see a silver lining in the postponement, in that it offers an opportunity for global leadership. The pandemic has thrown everything up in the air, but leaders will be looking for ways to show their leadership and put it in a good light, says Rose Gottemoeller, a former Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security, and until recently a Deputy Secretary General at NATO. For example, she says President Donald Trump is likely to want a big foreign policy win to tout in his re-election campaign, and that could prompt the U.S. to take some disarmament action, such as extending the New START arms reduction treaty with Russia before the November election. More broadly, Ms. Gottemoeller says the context of a global pandemic can actually be a boon to the search for more cooperation on other issues. I continue to believe that the coronavirus pandemic is providing an opportunity for leaders to come together around international institutions and agreements and to restart commitments to international cooperation, says Ms. Gottemoeller, now a distinguished lecturer at Stanford University's Center for International Security and Cooperation in Palo Alto, California. The NPT regime is no different, she adds, so I believe we'll see treaty signatories coming together around the position that this is a good treaty, let's recommit to it and strengthen it going forward. A pessimistic view. Yet despite his hopes for new thinking on nuclear issues in the months ahead, Mr. Sokolsky says he worries that a remarkably successful 50-year-old treaty might not last another decade. The NPT took effect in 1970 based on the basic bargain that the 5 nuclear-armed states in the UN Security Council, the US, Russia, China, France, and the United Kingdom, would move towards the elimination of all nuclear weapons, while the non-nuclear states committed to not seeking or developing such weapons, but would have access to peaceful nuclear energy uses. The NPT took effect in a world where many countries had nuclear weapons programs, but today only India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea stand outside the treaty. Over the last half century, the two largest nuclear weapons powers, the U.S. and Russia, have indeed sharply reduced their stockpiles, but more recently, those two powers have shifted to modernizing their arsenals as China has moved to expand its arsenal. Moreover, the U.S. and Russia have moved away from disarmament treaties, with the last major treaty between them, New START, set to expire February 2021. Increasingly, non-weapon states see the nuclear powers as failing to hold up their end of the NPT bargain, a sentiment that has prompted some NPT members to pursue new initiatives without the major powers. In 2017, 81 countries signed on to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, a document rejected by the nuclear weapons states. Given the percolating ire of the non-nuclear states, some experts say they are not certain that the postponement of the NPT review conference will lead to greater global unity on disarmament and non-proliferation down the road. For sure, the review conference set for next week was a train wreck waiting to happen, but nothing guarantees that we'll find ourselves in 9 months or a year in a better position, says Wagaguru Paul Sidhu, an expert on multilateral and UN issues at New York University's Center for Global Affairs. The opportunity is there, but there's also a risk of even more disunity. Much will depend on how countries, and especially the major powers, choose to address the coronavirus pandemic, Mr. Sidhu says. Proceeding with a spirit of we're one world in this together, could in turn foster a greater sense of cooperation on other issues, including nuclear weapons and proliferation. But a you're-on-your-own approach could sour the atmosphere of a major international effort like the NPT review. People are talking about international solidarity for addressing COVID-19, but on the other hand, we have the proliferation really of these nation-first approaches. America first, Brazil first, India first. That sets a tone that does not encourage greater cooperation, he says. Less time for mischief. Some experts worry that what Ms. Gottemoeller calls the mischief makers in the nuclear area, foremost among them North Korea and Iran, could use the months before the NPT conference to advance their nuclear programs and further weaken the global nuclear proliferation regime. To further weaken the global nuclear non-proliferation regime. But even there, Ms. Gottemoeller says the pandemic has changed her thinking on how some states are likely to proceed on nuclear issues over the coming months. My view has shifted on this. I think the pandemic means they have less time and less incentive to make mischief because they need the help of the international community, she says. She cites the example of Saudi Arabia, which has alarmed the non-proliferation community with talk of purchasing nuclear facilities that could leave it in possession of the fuel and other building blocks for an eventual nuclear weapon program. But other challenges are likely to put provocative moves like a nuclear program on the back burner, Mrs. Gottemoeller says. I don't think they'll be focused at this moment on buying nuclear reactors. I think that's some additional food for thought. Our next article is titled, With Humans Stuck at Home, Mother Nature Takes Over. Researchers are discovering what happens in nature when people step back. Cleaner air and roaming wildlife are giving us extraordinary insight into just how much of a mess we humans are making of our beautiful planet, says one scientist. By Seth Borenstein, Associate Press. An unplanned grand experiment is changing Earth. As people across the globe stay home to stop the spread of the new coronavirus, the air has cleaned up, albeit temporarily. Smog stopped choking New Delhi, one of the most polluted cities in the world, and India's getting views of sites not visible in decades. Nitrogen dioxide pollution in the northeastern United States is down 30%. Rome air pollution levels from mid-March to mid-April were down 49% from a year ago. Stars seem more visible at night. People are also noticing animals in places and at times they don't usually. Coyotes have meandered along downtown Chicago's Michigan Avenue and near San Francisco's Golden Gate Bridge. A puma roamed the streets of Santiago, Chile. Goats took over a town in Wales. In India, already daring wildlife has become bolder, with hungry monkeys entering homes and opening refrigerators to look for food. When people stay home, Earth becomes cleaner and wilder. It is giving us this quite extraordinary sight into just how much of a mess we humans are making of our beautiful planet, says conservation scientist student Pim of Duke University. This is giving us an opportunity to magically see how much better it can be. Chris Field, director of the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment, assembled scientists to assess the ecological changes happening with so much of humanity housebound. Scientists stuck at home like the rest of us say they are eager to explore unexpected changes in weeds, insects, weather patterns, noise, and light pollution. Italy's government is working on an ocean expedition to explore sea changes from the lack of people. In many ways, we kind of whacked the Earth system with a sledgehammer, and now we see what Earth's response is, Mr. Field says. Researchers are tracking dramatic drops in traditional air pollutants, such as nitrogen dioxide, smog, and tiny particles. These types of pollution kill up to 7 million a year worldwide, according to Health Effects Institute President Dan Greenbaum. The air from Boston to Washington is its cleanest since a NASA satellite started measuring nitrogen dioxide in 2005. Says NASA atmospheric scientist Barry Leffer. Largely caused by burning of fossil fuels, this pollution is short-lived, so the air gets cleaner quickly. Compared to the previous 5 years, March air pollution is down 46% in Paris, 35% in Bengaluru, India, 38% in Sydney, 29% in Los Angeles, 26% in Rio de Janeiro, and 9% in Durban, South Africa. NASA measurements show. We're getting a glimpse of what might happen if we start switching to non-polluting cars, Mr. Leffer said. Cleaner air has been most noticeable in India and China. On April 3rd, residents of Jandalahar, a city in North India's Punjab, woke up to a view not seen for decades: snow-capped Himalayan peaks more than 100 miles away. Cleaner air means stronger lungs for asthmatics, especially children, says Dr. Mary Prunicki, Director of Air Pollution and Health Research at Stanford University School of Medicine. And she notes early studies also link coronavirus severity to people with bad lungs and those in more polluted areas, though it's too early to tell which factor is stronger. The greenhouse gases that trap heat and cause climate change stay in the atmosphere for 100 years or more, so the pandemic shutdown is unlikely to affect global warming, says Breakthrough Institute climate scientist Zeke Hosfather. Carbon dioxide levels are still rising, but not as fast as last year. Aerosol pollution, which doesn't stay airborne long, is also dropping. But aerosols cool the planet, so NASA climate scientist Gavin Schmidt is investigating whether their falling levels may be warming local temperatures for now. Stanford's Mr. Fields says he is most intrigued by increasing urban sightings of coyotes, pumas, and other wildlife that are becoming video social media staples. Boar-like javelinas congregated outside of an Arizona shopping center. Even New York City birds seem hungrier and bolder. In Adelaide, Australia, police share a video of a kangaroo hopping around a mostly empty downtown, and a pack of jackals occupied an urban park in Tel Aviv, Israel. Mountain lions have been roaming the streets of Boulder, Colorado. We're not being invaded. The wildlife has always been there, but many animals are shy, Duke's Mr. Pims says. They come out when humans stay home. For sea turtles across the globe, humans have made it difficult to nest on sandy beaches. The turtles need to be undisturbed, and emerging hatchlings get confused by beachfront lights, says David Godfrey, Executive Director of the Sea Turtle Conservancy. But with lights and people away, this year's sea turtle nesting so far seems much better from India to Costa Rica to Florida, Mr. Godfrey says. There's some silver lining for wildlife in what otherwise is a fairly catastrophic times for humans, he says. Unable to gather en masse as they planned this Earth Day, April 22nd activists around the world planned live streams and webinars to keep the issue of climate front and center on the world stage and in the U.S. presidential race. This story was reported by the Associated Press. AP writer Aniruddha Gosal in New Delhi contributed to this report. I just want to say thank you, Mother Nature, and you go, baby turtles. Our next article is titled, Psst, the poachers are coming, how tiny birds tip off the rhinos. Even some mighty creatures get by better with a little help from their friends. In Africa, tiny birds are helping black rhinos avoid poachers, by Eva Botkin, Kawaki staff writer. From afar, a rhino looks a bit like a living, breathing tank, oblivious to the smaller critters around it, but these great beasts may actually be paying attention. Critically endangered due to poaching, black rhinoceroses have learned to tune into the alarm calls of little birds known as red-billed oxpeckers that hitchhike on their backs, according to a study published last week in the journal Current Biology. This isn't a completely new revelation. In fact, the Swahili name for oxpecker translates to the rhino's guard. The relationship isn't completely harmonious, more on that later, but it does highlight the interconnectedness of the natural world. And for Western science, it offers an expanded view of how eavesdropping fits into the social order of animals and how animals communicate and interact with one another more broadly. Who would have thought that a 2-ton behemoth would pay attention to what this tiny bird sitting on their back says Eric Green, a professor of biology at the University of Montana in Missouri. These studies of animals, University of Montana in Missoula. These study of animals' behavior show us just how attuned species are to each other in weird and mysterious and wonderful ways. Researchers used to see animals' communication in fairly simple terms, says Dr. Green, largely individuals of the same species sending direct signals to each other. But, he says, we're realizing that eavesdropping is huge. Dr. Green wasn't involved in this particular study, but his own research focuses on the soundscapes created by birds and small mammals in forests. Everybody basically is listening to everybody else, he says. In fact, birds and squirrels seem to communicate warnings in tandem. Birds have a specific alarm call to alert others that a predator is present or approaching, called a seat call for how it sounds. And Dr. Green has observed squirrels making and responding to that same sound. They're basically speaking the same language, he says. In his research, he has encountered similar interactions in forests around the world. Some researchers had surmised that social vocal species might be the only ones eavesdropping and that solitary species might not have the necessary capabilities, but rhinos are neither social nor very vocal. It seems to be that their vulnerability to human predation may be more of a key factor, says study author Rowan Plotz, a behavioral ecologist and lecturer in environmental science at Victoria University in Melbourne, Australia. Perhaps it's a predation threat alone and not sociality that drives the capacity to eavesdrop, he says. Predation certainly is a large factor in shaping many behaviors in ecosystems, says Daniel Bloomstein, a professor of ecology and evolutionary biology at the University of California, Los Angeles, who was also not involved in the new study. I think we expect that any species that has any risk of predation to pay attention to what's going on in its environment, to understand changes in threats. The risk of predation seems to be a powerful force driving the rhinos to accept the discomfort of the oxpecker's presence. Although the birds munch on harmful parasites on the beasts, they also feed on open wounds in the rhino's flesh, a behavior that makes some other creatures try to toss the birds off. But the black rhinos can't see very well to spot poachers, which may be why they seem to tolerate the annoyances that come with the auditory warning. The rhino-oxpecker relationship doesn't come as a surprise to black rhino experts like Mike Knight, chairman of the International Union for Conservation of Nature's African Rhino Specialist Group. And in an email to the Monitor, Dr. Knight cautions against overstating the results based on a small sample size. Dr. Plotz and colleagues focused much of their research on 14 black rhinos that they had already fitted with tracking devices for a different study. In the first phase of the study, the researchers counted how many rhinos with birds on them they could find without the aid of tracking devices. According to their hypothesis, they expected to primarily find rhinos without any hitchhikers because the birds would have alerted the animals to their presence. Indeed, out of 100 rhino sightings, just 17 had oxpeckers perched on them. In their control group of tracked rhinos, 56 out of 100 rhinos had birds on them. Then they tried sneaking up on the rhinos. The beasts without birds on their backs reacted just 23% of the time when the approaching human was an average of 27 meters or 88 feet away. The rhinos with oxpeckers atop reacted every time, and the human was much farther away, at an average of 61 meters or 200 feet. Questions remain about why the birds call when a human approaches in the first place. They themselves are not in danger from poachers, so are they warning the rhino? Or perhaps warning each other that this behemoth on which they are riding is about to make a sudden movement. Dr. Plotz and his colleagues have suggested that their study might offer another tactic in conserving rhinos: protect and replenish the diminishing population of oxpeckers. Dr. Knight is skeptical of that, saying he sometimes uses the alarm calls of oxpeckers to locate rhinos himself. So perhaps poachers have learned the same thing. Furthermore, this warning system may also not have much of an actual impact in reducing poaching, Dr. Knight says. Since 1960, the black rhino population has plummeted by an estimate of 97.6%, largely due to poaching, according to the IUCN estimates. Even when oxpeckers were more plentiful, Dr. Knight said, the rhino population was being devastated. However, Dr. Knight adds, anything that might reduce poaching is good, and the oxpeckers also serve an important ecological function as they pick parasites off the bodies of many species, including rhinos. So he says they're worth protecting for a myriad of reasons. Regardless, Dr. Bloomstein says this study highlights the interconnectedness in the animal world. Nature is grand and complex, and it's studies like this that are beginning to show us the complexities of relationships between species, he said. When we lose species, we lose those relationships, and we can't necessarily predict when or how systems are going to fall apart when you start pulling apart important relationships. May we all protect those rhinos from poachers. Well, my friends, that concludes the reading of the Tuesday Christian Science Monitor. This is PM saying thank you for being with us today, and please stay safe.